Hi everyone, and welcome to this Transatlantic Currents webinar titled Retooling Transatlantic Defense and Security Relations Within and Beyond Europe. My name is Maria Linden, and I'm a research fellow at the Center on U.S. Politics and Power here at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. And I will shortly hand the virtual mic over to the people that you've actually come to listen to today. But before I do so, just a couple of practicalities regarding questions from the audience. We will have a Q&A section at the end of the webinar. But as you listen to the conversation, please feel free to type in questions and comments using the chat function. You can do so at any time. Our chair will later read some of them out loud and give our guest speaker an opportunity to answer them. Now, to introduce our wonderful speakers, our guest will be interviewed by our non-resident fellow, Leo Michel, who is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Leo has had a decades-long career in U.S. government, where he served as a Government Distinguished Research Fellow at the Institute for National Strategic Studies, Director for NATO Policy, and Director for Non-Nuclear Arms Control at the OSD and the Pentagon. He has degrees from Johns Hopkins and Princeton University. Chairing the conversation today is Matti Pesu, a senior research fellow in the Finnish Foreign Policy, Northern European Security and NATO Research Program here at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. He has led multiple research projects analyzing Finland's security policy and NATO policy, and he has a PhD from Tampere University. Our guest, Ambassador Julian Smith, is the president and co-founder of Clarion Strategies and a former U.S. permanent representative to NATO. But I'll let Leo introduce her further. Leo, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Maria, and hello from what is a chilly morning in Washington. I'm delighted to welcome Ambassador Smith to this edition of Transatlantic Currents. As Maria mentioned, she is the president and the co-founder with former Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin of Clarion Strategies, which is a Washington-based consulting firm with international reach, I should add. She was the U.S. permanent representative to NATO from 2021 to 2024, after serving as a senior advisor to Secretary of State Tony Blinken. During the Obama administration, she was a senior advisor in the Pentagon on NATO and European policy, and later became the national security advisor to then Vice President Joe Biden. Without further ado, let's turn first to the subject of Russia's war on Ukraine. And I'd like to take just a minute to review some of the rather dramatic developments that we have witnessed just over the past 3 to 4 weeks. For example, a 28-point plan drawn up by special envoys of Presidents Trump and Putin was leaked to the press. It was widely viewed as highly favorable to the Russian side's demands. Soon after, the transcript of a phone call leaked to the press. It suggested that Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, had coached a Putin advisor on how to manage the American president and, in essence, undermine President Zelensky's talks at the White House. We've also seen urgent consultations involving European leaders, evidently aimed at keeping U.S. decision makers on side. Still, leaked notes from a conference call among European leaders last week suggested that some feared a U.S., quote, betrayal, unquote, of Ukraine. Then another meeting occurred between Witkoff, joined this time by Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, to discuss a revised proposal with Putin. Trump called it a, quote, reasonably good, quote, meeting, saying Witkoff and Kushner were confident that Putin wanted to end the war. And on Sunday, the American president said he was disappointed with President Zelensky, claiming that the Ukrainian leader had not even read the latest proposal, while asserting, in Mr. Trump's words, that Russia's fine with it. And yesterday, following his meeting with the British, French, and German leaders in London, Zelensky stated that Ukraine had no legal or moral right to give up any territory, which is, of course, a key demand of Russia, while he acknowledged that the Americans are looking for him to compromise. In short, the promise of the Biden administration that the United States will be on the side of Ukraine for as long as it takes seems like a distant memory. So, Julie, if I may, what's your assessment of the US administration's approach, both in form and in substance, to the negotiations with our allies, with Ukraine, and with Russia? What are the stakes, in your view, for European and transatlantic security?
Well, thank you very much, Leo, for the introduction. Thanks to the Finnish Institute for International Affairs for the invitation, and good afternoon to everybody on the other side of the Atlantic. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. Maybe I'll say a couple of different thoughts on that front. First and foremost, it's clear that the Trump administration is keen to make a very strong push towards some sort of resolution in Ukraine. And as you noted, we've seen a flurry of activity, meetings both with the Russians and the Ukrainians. But unfortunately, in my view, we are no closer to some sort of settlement in Ukraine. I have seen a couple of things that worry me about the way in which the current U.S. administration is pursuing peace in Ukraine. Top of that list is the 28-point plan that came out initially. In my view, the items on that list resembled very much the requests and the demands that Russia was making even before the war in Ukraine started. Your listeners might remember that in January of 2022, before Russia went into Ukraine, we actually held a NATO-Russia council at NATO. The Russians came to NATO. I was there. We had a 4-hour-long meeting with the Russians. And when they presented a list of demands, it in essence looked quite similar to what they're asking now. They do not want Ukraine to be part of the alliance. They want a rather weak Ukraine that doesn't have strong Western support or a strong military. They wanted limits on U.S. and NATO force posture in Eastern Europe. The list went on and on. So to me, it is deeply familiar when I look, everything feels deeply familiar when I look at the Russian demands. What's disturbing to me is what the U.S. seems to be putting forward mirrors those Russian demands quite closely. And so my view of the current situation is that the United States is tilting more towards the Russian position than the Ukrainian position. I believe that Ukraine has already made a number of concessions. I don't see Russia making concessions on their side. And I don't believe that the current U.S. administration is using the pressure that it could apply on Moscow to alter Putin's calculus. So in broad strokes, like perhaps members of the Trump administration, I too am frustrated that we can't see peace in Ukraine, but I wish that the current administration would apply more pressure on the Russian side. Lastly, in terms of process, two concerns here. One is Europe doesn't seem to be playing much of a role in the negotiations. Obviously, we had the meeting yesterday of the three leaders in Europe, Starmer, Macron, and Merz, meeting with Zelensky in London. But really, at the end of the day, it doesn't appear, sadly, that Europe has much of a voice or a vote at the table as these negotiations unfold. So that's the first thing that I find troubling. And finally, looking at Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner at the table with Putin, I worry that they are not paired with some U.S. experts that have decades-long experience negotiating with the Russians. Putin has been around a long time. He is quite a skilled negotiator. He likes to manipulate the folks that are across the table. And I would love to have Kushner and Witkoff sitting there with a couple of other one or two experts on Putin, on Russia, on how they negotiate, because if you don't have that type of expertise, Putin can be quite crafty and really run circles around the folks that are on the other side of the table. So those are some process questions or insights or concerns that I have, paired with a couple of substantive concerns as well.
Thanks. Could you expand a little bit on, with one or two examples of where you would like to see, realizing once again, you are not in government, you're not part of this administration, but if you were asked for your advice, what would you like to see in terms of additional pressures on the Russians to back away from some of these longstanding concerns, longstanding demands of theirs? And on the flip side, you mentioned that Europe, by the U.S. and by Russia, has been largely cut out of the actual negotiations. How would you suggest Europe to better apply its various tools and its resources to help defend Ukraine, to deter further aggression by Russia, and to plan for the eventual reconstruction of Ukraine if, especially, the U.S. is not really aligned with Europe, or at worst, if the U.S. becomes tired or simply indifferent to the fate of Ukraine?
So on the Russian side of things, I applauded the Trump administration's decision to place sanctions on Lukoil and Rosneft. I thought that was a very important step forward and no doubt would capture Putin's attention and understand that the U.S. was willing and prepared to use pressure and leverage the leverage that it had. Unfortunately, some of those sanctions have been loosened for reasons that are not clear to me, but I do believe that Congress is also at the ready to play a more active role. There are now over 80 senators ready to move forward with secondary sanctions. You could move out on that front. You could go after the shadow fleet in the Baltic Sea. There are a variety of ways in which the U.S. government could apply pressure on Moscow. But again, I don't see the U.S. expressing an interest in doing that. We see glimpses at times of the president becoming quite frustrated with President Putin, as he should be. And occasionally deadlines are set, but they tend to come and go, as they did in July of this year. There was a 50-day deadline that came and went, really with no punitive measures or consequences for Russia for missing that deadline. I also believe that the U.S. could signal to Russia that if they don't play ball, if Russia isn't willing to make certain concessions, the U.S. will take more dramatic, stronger steps to support Ukraine. You'll remember it wasn't that long ago that the president talked quite openly about providing Tomahawks to Ukraine. That is something that I'd love to see happen. And again, I was quite encouraged when I heard the president talking about that option. In fact, when President Zelensky came over to the United States on his last visit, I was actually quite sure that there would be some announcement about Tomahawks. Now, unfortunately, that didn't come to pass, but I believe a move like that, a decision or an announcement to double down on support to Ukraine, would send a very important signal to Moscow that if they're not willing to negotiate, if they're not willing to come to the table and make some very concrete concessions, that the United States is prepared then to go deeper in its support of Ukraine proper. So those are a couple of ideas of how the U.S. could help Putin come to the table to be more open-minded. I really don't see him making any concessions at all. And in fact, his demands are still in what I would call the maximalist category. In terms of Europe's role in all of this and how they kind of enter as a more consequential player in the negotiations. I mean, look, we've seen a number of European leaders travel frantically back and forth across the Atlantic. Von der Leyen and Rutte at the EU and NATO have been very engaged, as have many leaders across the European continent. Right now, I believe those leaders need to come back to Washington. They need to have a very direct conversation with the president. and put a couple of demands of their own on the table. One, I think Ruta has to make crystal clear that Russia does not get a voice or a veto on NATO enlargement, full stop. NATO enlargement is something that is determined by the candidate country and the NATO alliance, not by Russia. And Russia's drive to shut down NATO enlargement is an age-old tactic. We've seen that request for years. And the response from NATO repeatedly has been, you don't get to decide. This is not your decision. And yet, Russia continues to demand that not only Ukraine not become a member of the alliance, but that NATO alliance shuts down its enlargement efforts, efforts across the board. So that would close out NATO membership to countries like Georgia or Bosnia or other countries that have been hoping to join the NATO alliance. I also think Europe is stronger than it believes it is. Oftentimes, I think they approach Washington quite cautiously. Obviously, they are in the middle of a very difficult set of trade conversations and negotiations. The tariffs have been uncomfortable for Europe and very difficult to navigate. There are a number of regulatory debates and differences across the Atlantic, but still, given that Europeans are providing most of the support to Ukraine at this moment, they deserve to be at the table. At a minimum, they deserve to be briefed each time the United States engages with Moscow. One thing I'll say just in closing is there were a number of instances before the war started where US officials would engage Russian officials to see if they might head off Russia's plans to invade Ukraine. Each time that happened, the US official in question that was traveling to Moscow would make a stop in Brussels to ensure that our allies were brought up to speed and up to date on what had just transpired in Moscow. Unfortunately, after Witkoff and Kushner went to Moscow, they did not make a stop in Brussels. And in fact, Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Marco Rubio, who could have briefed allies on those engagements at the recent NATO Foreign Ministerial, opted not to go to the meeting. That obviously was met with frustration on the part of our European allies. They really wanted a firsthand account of what had unfolded. They thought Rubio would be the second best alternative, and instead they got the Deputy Secretary of State, whom I understand didn't even stay for the full session. So there is some mounting frustration there that Europeans can't get a clear read on what's happening. They were broadsided by the 28-point plan and really deserve to be included and updated on these negotiations as they unfold.
Well, you've included a lot of that, and on this subject, maybe I'm going to let follow-up questions come in later from the audience. But this maybe is a good point to expand our discussion to cover the Trump administration's broader view of Europe. Many in our audience have already read reporting and commentary, I think, about the recently released U.S. national security strategy. We call it in Washington, people just refer to it as the NSS, which is a mandated report, mandated by Congress. And I'm going to ask our colleagues right now in Helsinki to post a link to that document on the chat function. And that would really encourage members of the audience to take the time to read it. It's about 32, 33 pages. If I may just ask you, one is a basic question. Because of your long and very high level service in government, what is the purpose? How would you explain the purpose of the National Security Strategy document? How does it relate to other strategies that have not yet been released, specifically the National Defense Strategy, the National Military Strategy? And then I'm going to ask you to focus on about the 2.5 pages of that 30-page document to focus on Europe.
Well, the national security strategy is something that's drafted roughly once every 4 years. It is often rolled out in the first year of a new administration's tenure. It is an important document. Your listeners might be surprised to hear oftentimes for internal debates in a new administration. As one might expect, when a new administration is settling in to its new role, there are often fierce debates across the leaders, the cabinet members, the senior leaders in the national security community about the key tenets of their national security strategy going forward for the next 4 years. And by drafting this document, you're actually forcing the interagency to work through some of those debates about where will you apply U.S. resources, what kind of military strategy do you want to have, what kind of defense strategy. As you noted, there are other strategies that come after the national security strategy, but it in essence provides a framing for the new administration so that everyone working in the U.S. government, whether you are a newly minted political appointee and you just recently came into government, or whether you are a career civil servant who has spent 20 or 30 years working for the U.S. government, that everybody has an appreciation of the general framing under which you are now working. It is also an important signaling document. It provides information to our allies and our adversaries about where the current U.S. administration is going to apply its energy and what it is most concerned about in terms of adversaries. But I will also tell your listeners that you have to be careful not to overstate the importance of the NSS. It is common for administrations to lay out an NSS in the first year and then end up traveling down different paths as time unfolds and new crises erupt and new innovations come to the forefront and new sets of relationships unfold or different types of conflicts emerge. And so it is not an airtight document that serves as the guiding light for all 4 years. It is a framing that gives outsiders and insiders an ability to kind of set the table and understand where the U.S. intends to head. But if you took many national security strategies over decades and compared them to where the U.S. administration actually went, you would find some differences in there. Now let's get to the new NSS that just recently dropped. This was a very unusual NSS in multiple ways. It is heavily focused on the president himself, which is not altogether common. It is quite light on sketching out America's adversaries. If you're looking for strong language on Russia, for example, you will not find it in this document. Russia is referenced here and there, but often in regards to Europe's relationship with Russia, which I found striking and frankly quite troubling. China, which I expected to be kind of the key feature of the document, actually ranks second after a heavy emphasis by the current U.S. administration on the Western Hemisphere. We are, in essence, returning to a bit of the Monroe Doctrine, where the U.S. was quite focused on preserving its kind of almost sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere. This is from many years ago, but it feels like a little bit of Back to the Future on the Monroe Doctrine itself. And then the emphasis on China is less about some of the challenges we face and more on kind of the economics of the relationship, which are critical, but you're missing kind of the battle over artificial intelligence, the importance of maintaining America's technological edge. And I see less about the threats to the United States from any place in the world, Iran, North Korea, nuclear threats, terrorism. It's all quite muted in my sense. And then let's come to what I found to be perhaps the most shocking part of the national security strategy. I've worked on Europe for 30 years. I was struck by the tone in that Europe section. It is very accusatory towards Europe. It is very critical of Europe. This is not a document that heralds America's close relationship with its allies and partners across the Atlantic. There is almost no mention about our shared history, shared values. It is about a civilizational struggle, cultural struggles, comments about kind of where Europe is headed and the changes that would be required for Europe to make to get on a better track. So I found the Europe section to be not altogether surprising because it does mirror what we heard from the vice president at the Munich Security Conference earlier this year. But it was striking to me that it didn't really place a lot of value on our relationship with Europe. And it felt more to me like a lot of finger wagging of Europe needs to do X, Y, and Z. So that was kind of a shift from, what we've seen from quite a dramatic shift from what we've seen from prior national security strategies, even in Donald Trump's first term. If you look back, you should read the national security strategy that was released in the first Trump administration. The differences are quite clear, and it's worth comparing those. And I think it says a lot about the people who are around the president. I think the first time you had more centrist Republicans who were more committed, perhaps, to or more interested in preserving America's relationship with its closest allies and partners. The current group around the president clearly puts less value on that and doesn't have any nostalgia about kind of 70 years, 80 years of working together. So you've lost that tone that was even present in the first NSS. So it is worth a read, if not for just the Europe section, but also try to find something in there that really represents the challenge that Russia poses to both North America and to Europe today.
Thank you. I mean, I think you've covered many of the, frankly, many of the things that I noticed as well in the document, and I can only emphasize how important it would be, how useful it would be for the audience to read the document itself. In a few minutes, I want to turn to our audience questions that they are writing into the chat. But I'd like to take just a few minutes to look forward a little bit. I was very intrigued by a recent essay that you wrote with a co-author, Lindsay Ford, titled The New Eurasian Order, and it was published in the November-December edition of the widely respected review Foreign Affairs. Let's start with the basics, because you argue that the United States is at the point that it should really link its transatlantic and its Indo-Pacific strategies in an atmosphere where China and Russia are certainly synchronizing their, as you call them, their transgressions and their sharing of weapons and know-how, posing as greater, more formidable threat than the United States has faced in decades. So the NSS, I'll just mention here, which we just discussed, it argues for increased burden sharing on defense from Japan and South Korea, even favors stronger cooperation with India. But if China is the preeminent military and security threat to U.S. interests in that Indo-Pacific region, what do you think European allies can meaningfully contribute to U.S. deterrence and defense in the region, particularly when we seem to be, and I think you argue this in your article, this administration seems to be saying, well, Europe should concern itself with European affairs and take a bigger role there.
Well, let's back up. So the United States, for many decades, whether it's a Republican in the Oval Office or whether it has been a Democrat in the Oval Office, has had essentially the same approach, and that is fortify relationships across the Atlantic and across the Pacific, but keep those relationships separate. And that's just been a longstanding U.S. policy, easier in some ways to manage them in separate orbits, in separate regions, and to divide the world up into different regional engagements. When Joe Biden came into office as president, he opted to kind of challenge that premise, in part because what we were seeing was this ever closer relationship between Russia and China. They were moving together, and they had been moving closer together for a number of years. But we had this turning point moment. You'll remember right before the war started in Ukraine, Russia and China announced this no limits partnership, and they meant it. And then as the war has unfolded, China has, in essence, been able to prop up Russia's economy. China has provided a number of dual-use components, machine tools, microelectronics that have allowed Russia to pursue this war in Ukraine. We've seen instances where both Russia and China have used air assets to intimidate allies in the Indo-Pacific, whether it's South Korea or Japan. We've seen them using the same set of narratives, whether it's been on COVID-19 conspiracy theories or the conspiracy theory that NATO started the war in Ukraine. And the gray zone tactics that Russia uses in a very crafty way in Europe, whether it's cyber attacks, economic coercion, or flying Russian jets into Estonian airspace, China is learning from those gray zone tactics and increasingly using the same set of tactics over in the Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific. So we had instructions from the president early on in the Biden administration, let's get more creative. As Russia and China assembles their own team on the field and they deepen their partnerships with countries like Iran and North Korea, let us, the United States, get more creative about bringing our friends in the Indo-Pacific closer together with our friends in Europe and see what we can do together. And now there was a natural way to do that because the war in Ukraine provided an opportunity for Australia, South Korea, and Japan to provide important humanitarian, economic, and security assistance to our friends in Ukraine. And there were so many interesting opportunities for us at NATO to work ever closer with those Indo-Pacific partners to find some creative ways to share best practices, to share insights. And the piece that you mentioned in Foreign Affairs starts with an interesting story. And for those of you that haven't read the piece, let me just share the anecdote. And that is in October of last year, when Russia welcomed North Korean soldiers into Russia to fight in Ukraine, South Korea sent a group of intelligence officials to the NATO alliance to brief NATO allies on who those troops were, what kind of training they had, whether to determine whether or not they had ever operated on the ground together with Russians, what we might expect from this now pairing of Russian and North Korean soldiers. And that gives you a clear sense of two things. One, this ever closer set of kind of Andrea Kendall Taylor at CNIS calls it the axis of upheaval, this closer network of Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. But it also gives you an interesting insight into how NATO is working more closely with countries in the Indo-Pacific, not for them to join the alliance. We're not suggesting a global NATO. We are suggesting that we get more creative in the ways in which we bring these two regions together. Now, fast forward to the current US administration, they have taken a different approach. They are returning to the older approach, which is everybody go to your corners. Europe, you focus on Europe. Indo-Pacific allies, you focus on your neighborhood. I get the logic of that because we've done that for a long time and there's a lot to do. But I think you can have these allies walk and chew gum at the same time. You can have the United Kingdom focused on the Russia threat, but it can also send a ship into the South China Sea and help keep free, open Indo-Pacific, the sea lanes open and free. So what we propose in the piece is that the U.S. get in the game. I think what's going to happen without the United States is some of these relationships now between Europe and the Indo-Pacific are moving forward with or without the United States, and we have an option. We can join these initiatives and help shape them, or we can sit it out, continue to tell them to stick to their corners. They will not do that because the world is a very different place now. And we may wake up in 3 to 4 years and discover all sorts of interesting partnerships. I mean, Japan, Italy, and the United Kingdom are talking about building a 6th generation fighter jet together. That is a pretty clear indication that those regional groupings are breaking down. And so this piece is a plea for all of us to do more together, North America, Europe, and the Indo-Pacific coming together, not just in the military space, because Europe has limits on what it can do militarily in the Indo-Pacific, but economically, from a trade perspective, from a digital and emerging tech perspective, from a regulatory perspective, and also to share best practices on countering the hybrid tactics that Russia and Chinese actors use all the time.
Thanks, Julie. It's a very compelling argument, in my opinion, and you've explained it also in a very articulate and I would say even eloquent way. Let's turn now to Matti. I see that there have been a number of questions posed in the chat function. Thank you again, Ambassador Julianne Smith.
Yes, thank you so much, Ambassador Smith and my colleague Leo for a very wide-ranging and timely discussion and offered a really comprehensive overview of the transatlantic landscape and beyond, providing a solid foundation for the Q&A session that I have the pleasure of chairing. So again, as Leo pointed out, my role is to convey the views and the questions presented in the chat, and in doing that, I will take let's say a degree of editorial license. So I combine questions where appropriate and so on. And there are already two questions in the chat. So perhaps we first get back to the NSS, and in Europe, let's say it has received sort of perhaps it's been received mixed emotions. Some are like even disturbed, shocked. So how should we read the document here in Europe? Should we be alarmed, or should we understand it as perhaps a peculiar intellectual manifesto with limited practical implications? So that's the first question. And the second question pertaining to the strategy, that there is this new ideological element. So is that in your view the U.S. administration really involved to intervene in European affairs, supporting certain political movements? So two-pronged discussion, two-pronged question on the NSS first.
Well, I guess a couple of things on that front. I mean, I think Europeans tend to make a couple of assumptions. I think one, some Europeans look back at Trump's first term and they think to themselves, Look, we were able to get quite a bit done with the Trump administration. The sky did not fall. The U.S. remained an active member of the NATO alliance. We were able to work together on a couple of different shared challenges. And therefore, we will use the same optimistic framing, for Trump's second term. And again, I think you have to think about what has changed. There are different sets of players around the president that have different views towards Europe. We have a full-fledged war now on the European continent that adds enormous complexity to the situation. And we have an instance where, just to blend into your second question, we have a US administration that is quite comfortable talking about European politics, and it is willing in certain cases to put its thumb on the scale and support certain parties. You'll remember that when the vice president came to Germany for the Munich Security Conference earlier this year, he was quite comfortable sitting down and meeting with the AfD in Germany, while not at all interested in meeting with some of the other parties in power. So this is an administration that, in my mind, is quite different from what occurred in the first administration. You do not have Jim Mattis as Secretary of Defense, who believed deeply in the NATO alliance and in working closely with our allies, and was prepared to defend that position through and through during his tenure as Secretary of Defense. You do not have an H.R. McMaster. You do not have John Kelly as the Chief of Staff, or even Mike Pompeo, who to this day talks about the importance of supporting Ukraine and ensuring that we do not give any concessions ourselves to the Russians. So I think for Europe, the NSS should be a little bit of a rude awakening, in the sense that it really presents some difficult questions for European leaders. Do they want to continue to pursue the current approach, which has been to try and compliment the president, think about positive aspects, sign off on the 5%? I mean, I want Europeans to spend more on defense, but they also have to be honest and clear-eyed about what they're willing to do and what they can and cannot do. And you got to be careful about reassuring the U.S. president that you can get to 5% within a year or two. I mean, this could take more than a decade for some allies. So I think Europe has to determine for itself what its approach now needs to be towards the U.S. administration. But I think it needs to be a relationship rooted in reality and honesty, frank conversation, open and honest debate. And I recognize the difficulties for Europe in challenging this administration, because it does have a bit of a weaker hand to play on the economic side, and it is worried. Europe is clearly worried about the tariffs and what punitive measures this president could use. But I think Europe is going to have to navigate these new sets of relationships, a new worldview towards Europe, and push back, if it so desires, on some of the ideological claims and requests of Europe. I mean, it's all couched in, we, the Trump administration, would like to have a stronger Europe. And I know that that's defined in a number of ways. I would agree with the Trump administration on we want more burden sharing. Where I disagree is in interfering in their elections and supporting populist parties and all the rest.
Yeah, moving to a question of burden sharing and European agency. So looking back to the last summer and the Hague summit, and a positive reading of that would be that it set in motion a process where Europe indeed takes more responsibility in burdening the conventional European security. But as you pointed out, like building up or ramping up European defense capabilities will be a lengthy process given the long cycles in defense planning and all the infrastructure requirements, personnel problems. So, and this reality coincides with the political volatility, not only in the US, but also in the international landscape and Europe. So like under these conditions, it's like a coordinated burden sharing or burden shifting process. Is it a realistic process? Can it be achieved? What's your view?
Yeah, I mean, Europe is going to, by all accounts, spend upwards of €1 trillion on defense over the next decade. And this is all good news. Europe has consistently underspent on its defense for many decades. I was quite proud of the record we had in the Biden administration. We moved in 4 years from 6 members of the NATO alliance spending 2% on defense to 23. It needs to be 32. And now, of course, they don't need to just get to 2%, but they need to get to 3.5% from a conventional perspective. So I applaud what was achieved at the Hague summit earlier this summer. It was an important development for the NATO alliance. But I also think we all have to be clear-eyed about some of the challenges. One of the biggest challenges in Europe right now is the fragmentation that exists across the continent. So there is a risk that all of this spending that's happening in Europe continues to flow into small silos in each individual country in Europe, because each country in Europe sees the opportunity, obviously, to grow its defense industry. And that is a very natural goal. It jobs creation. It creates all sorts of opportunities for that country to lead in the security realm. It makes each country stronger in the NATO alliance. But what ends up happening is Europe ends up producing 14 different tank systems that aren't necessarily all interoperable with one another when they really should have 2 or 3. And so my question to Europe is, how will Europe, while it is spending more on defense, do more to consolidate? Could NATO or the EU help with some of that consolidation? Could private sector, the big primes in Europe, BAE, Rheinmetall, Saab, you name it, could they help provide some of that consolidation? Do the banks have a role to play as they make more resources available and switch to serving as venture capitalists for some of the startups in Europe? So there is work to be done here, but there are some very clear-eyed challenges. There are also an array of countries that take the challenge and the call to action very seriously. Finland is a leader in dedicating real resources to its defense and security, and I applaud everything that is happening in Finland. It really has come into the alliance as a natural leader, and I've really been impressed by the way in which Finland has embraced its NATO membership, but also supported Ukraine and made the necessary investments in its national defense. There are other countries, I will not name, that are not as impressive, that rhetorically will say that they will invest more, but when it comes to concrete action, I'm not seeing the movement that's really required in this moment. I am also seeing a number of countries not dedicating the necessary resources to Ukraine that it's really needed right now. So I applaud, again, everything that's happening in Finland, but I wish what we see in Finland would be occurring in multiple European countries across the continent.
Thank you. I think that was an excellent analysis and diagnosis of like the opportunities and risks related to European defense efforts. Fully agree with many of your views. There is a question in the chat on European agency. Like you said that you've followed European security for 30 years. As an American observer, do you have ideas for Europe how to make like European agency vis-a-vis the US and even globally more effective In other words, do you have any suggestions how to make European teamwork, collective agency more effective? And you were quite optimistic in terms of what Europeans could achieve in engaging the Trump administration. Did I read you right?
Yeah, I mean, I think Europeans sometimes question the influence that they have in the transatlantic relationship. I think sometimes they see a pretty considerable imbalance in the relationship and view themselves as having more of an empty hand in grappling with some of the challenges that they perhaps see in engaging with this administration. Instead, I think Europe has a lot of strengths. I think Europe needs to make its case heard to its own publics, but also to the American public and to the US administration about all that it is providing for Ukraine right now. I don't think there is a deep appreciation on this side of the Atlantic for the amount of assistance that is being provided, continues to be provided. I think Europeans also really need to look at those Russian assets. And I know we're coming up to a very important meeting in Brussels that's not too far away, where European leaders are going to be faced with a very difficult decision about the degree to which they're willing to seize on those assets or move forward with additional loans based on the billions of euros that sit in and have been frozen, particularly mostly in Belgium. And I know it's a complicated question that the Belgian Prime Minister has real concerns at the moment about carrying the risk, but I think Europeans could get far more creative in helping Belgium cope with carrying that risk and find ways in which they can use that to not only give Ukraine the critical support that it needs at this moment in history, but also to show the United States that it's ready to take action and move out and be more of an equal player. I mean, if Europe moved out on the Russian assets, it just gives Europe, it puts Europe in a different position vis-a-vis Ukraine and the United States. And so I would really like to see Europe move out on that. And then I think, you know, the Secretary General, Mark Rutte, has a terrific relationship with President Trump. He's met more often with him than just about any other world leader, maybe minus Netanyahu. I don't know. I'd have to check the statistics here. But I think Mark Rutte is really up there and someone who's had the highest number of engagements with the president. I do think you can use that relationship to continue to drive home messages about the risks of getting played by President Putin, about the risks of agreeing never to expand NATO again, about the risks of leaving Ukraine in a weak position so that Russia just comes back and invades Ukraine a third time. And I think Europe has some influence and power here that it can wield or yield, but it would take a kind of a grouping of European leaders to come together and have kind of a singular position. And of course, we know that's always the challenge here, because you have Viktor Orban, who has his own perspectives on Ukraine and Russia and the European Union, while you've got a group of European leaders that look differently at some of those same issues. So I don't want to belittle the challenges of having Europe speak with one voice, but I think Europe does sometimes underestimate the influence that they might have in working more closely with the Trump administration and pushing back in cases where they have very clear disagreements.
Thank you. There are also questions in the chat that go beyond European security, but are very interesting with regard to the NSS and Trump administration. You already pointed out to the and also Leo, to the return of Monroe Doctrine or the Trump corollary, and also this like a hemispheric thinking in U.S. foreign policy. Do you sense that U.S. would be under Trump more willing to accept sort of spheres of influence thinking or spheres of influence design when it comes to global order? That let China take the Indo-Pacific, let Russia be the strongest player in Europe, and let the US be dominant on its own hemisphere. Do you think that the US would be ready to consider such a world?
Well, I think there were some indications in the national security strategy that certainly from a US perspective, it is going to be in the future most focused on its own sphere. It is going to be focused on the Western Hemisphere. It appears first in the document quite deliberately, and that shouldn't be a surprise because we've had indications for the past 10 months that that is the framing for the current administration. It doesn't seem like the US at this juncture is willing to walk away from Europe entirely and say, Russia, you do whatever you want. But again, as we talked about at the top, at least the initial draft with the 28-point plan seemed to tilt more towards Russia than to Ukraine. And that I found, again, quite troubling. And so I think we have to wait to see kind of how this is going to unfold. We've got the global posture review that will come out, and we'll have to see whether or not this administration is interested in withdrawing U.S. troops in Europe. We inserted 20,000 U.S. troops in Eastern Europe after the war started, and then we had another 80,000 or so in Western Europe, primarily in Germany and Italy. We'll see if there's just a small haircut on those numbers or whether or not we see drastic changes, and that might help us understand how the Trump administration views Europe and Russia and our obligations to provide security there over the medium and long term. In Asia, I mean, let's see how this meeting with Xi goes. I actually found it quite troubling that yesterday the Trump administration announced that it would be providing the NVIDIA H200 chips to China without getting anything in return. These chips are 6 times faster than anything that's been provided to China to date. In my mind, this starts to erode America's kind of technological edge when it comes to computing power, which remains one of our biggest strengths in the world. And so I didn't really care for the feel of that announcement because to me, the last thing we want to do is to allow the Chinese to catch up with us in the race towards artificial intelligence. So again, we've got some big events coming up, whether it's the Global Posture Review or this meeting with Xi and President Trump, that'll give us some additional indications about the degree to which this administration is framing the world in separate spheres of influence.
Yes, and thank you for flagging those indicators. I think that may be the last question of this session. So you have persuasively argued that Indo-Pacific theater and Europe are interlinked and interconnected. There's a question from my colleague Sarah Straub about this dynamic. I quote, if that cooperation was difficult when Russia was less assertive and transatlantic relations were warmer, how can that trans-regional cooperation thrive when the US is less willing and Europe appears less able, unquote.
Well, I believe the cooperation is well underway. We see several instances where European governments are reaching out to friends in Canada, in the Indo-Pacific, and in other corners around the world to develop new sets of relationships. I mean, look at the EU has been talking about an FTA with India forever. Maybe that is going to be within reach. We saw Indonesia recently make a visit to meet with von der Leyen in the European Union. We've seen Canada go deeper in its relationship with the European Union. We see instances where France, the EU, and Japan are conducting maritime training exercises together. I mean, look at the piece. In the foreign affairs piece that I wrote with Lindsay Ford, we actually cite a number of examples where the train has left the station. This type of cooperation is happening at a pretty rapid clip, in part because nations are hedging a little bit. Given the uncertainty surrounding the Trump administration in terms of how they view allies and partners, we are seeing our allies and partners get more creative in some of the outreach that they're pursuing. In some cases, they're doing it in spite of us. They're doing it without a U.S. nudge or a plea on the part of the United States. Instead, these relationships are unfolding in real time. And so for the U.S., the choice is either to watch that all unfold and be willing not to shape it or be a part of it, or to get in the game and join some of these new partnerships that are unfolding and see how we can best shape them. But I strongly believe that the train has left the station and that we're going to see more of this type of cooperation and not less of it.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I think our time is up. Here in Europe, the working day is gradually coming to an end, while in the US, it is just beginning. So on behalf of FIA, I would warmly thank Ambassador Smith for her valuable time and contribution to this webinar, and also want to thank our audience for their active participation, as well as Leo and Maria for their excellent facilitation. So want to wish you all wonderful December and a peaceful Christmas season. Thank you.
Thank you so much.